So I've been thinking a lot about how to give a 2 or 3 sentence summary of the fall of Constantinople. Some people might need some context. Constantinople, the last remnant of the Roman Empire, finally conquered by the Ottoman Turks after surviving for over 1,000 years beyond Rome itself. It's the end of an era that had lasted since antiquity. Constantinople wasn't just any city, it was the city. For over a millennium, it had been the jewel of the Christian world, the bridge between Europe and Asia, and honestly one of the most important cities in human history. The Romans had called it the New Rome when Constantine founded it in 330 AD. After the Western Roman Empire collapsed in 476, Constantinople kept going. It survived wave after wave of invaders, Persians, Arabs, Bulgars, you name it. The city had these absolutely massive walls, the Theodosian walls, which were basically impregnable for centuries. We're talking about triple-layered fortifications with a moat. It was a defensive masterpiece. But by 1453, the Byzantine Empire was a shadow of what it had been. At its height under Justinian in the 6th century, the Byzantines controlled most of the Mediterranean. By the 15th century, the empire was basically just Constantinople and a few surrounding territories. The Ottomans had been chipping away at Byzantine territory for decades, actually for over a century at this point. Constantinople was this isolated Christian island in an Ottoman sea. The city had been besieged multiple times before. The Arabs tried it, the Bulgars tried it, even the Fourth Crusade had sacked it in 1204, which was a whole different disaster. But it had always survived. The walls had always held. In 1451, Mehmed I became Sultan of the Ottoman Empire at the age of 19. This guy was ambitious. He's known to history as Mehmed the Conqueror, which should tell you how things went. His father and grandfather had both considered taking Constantinople, but Mehmed was obsessed with it. He wanted to be the one to finally capture the city that had defied conquest for so long. He started preparing immediately. He built a fortress on the European side of the Bosphorus called Rumeli Hisari, right across from another fortress on the Asian side. This gave him control of the strait and cut off Constantinople from any help that might come from the Black Sea. The Byzantines protested, obviously, but there wasn't much they could do about it. The Byzantine emperor at the time was Constantine XI Palaiologos. He'd become emperor in 1449, so he'd only been ruling for a few years when this crisis hit. Constantine knew what was coming. He sent desperate letters to Western Europe begging for help. The problem was that the Catholic West and the Orthodox East had split in 1054, the Great Schism, and there was still a lot of bad blood. The Byzantines had tried to heal the split with the Council of Florence in 1439, basically agreeing to papal supremacy in exchange for military aid, but this was hugely unpopular in Constantinople. A lot of Byzantines would rather fall to the Turks than submit to Rome. There's this famous quote, probably apocryphal, from a Byzantine official: "Better the Sultan's turban than the Pope's tiara." That gives you a sense of how bitter the religious divide was. Constantine managed to scrape together a defense force of maybe 7,000 men. Some sources say 8,000, some say as low as 5,000. It wasn't many. A few hundred Genoese soldiers showed up to help, led by a guy named Giovanni Giustiniani, who was apparently an expert in siege warfare. The Venetians sent a few ships, that was about it. Constantinople had a population of maybe 50,000 at this point, down from hundreds of thousands in its glory days. For comparison, Mehmed showed up with somewhere between 80,000 and 200,000 men, depending on which source you believe. Even if you take the lower estimate, the Ottomans outnumbered the defenders by more than 10 to 1. Mehmed also brought something new to the siege, really big cannons. There was this Hungarian engineer named Urban who had offered his services to Constantine first, but the Byzantines couldn't afford to pay him. So Urban went to Mehmed instead and built him the biggest cannon anyone had ever seen. This thing was massive, like 27 feet long, and it could fire a 600-pound stone ball over a mile. It took 60 oxen to move it and a crew of hundreds to operate it. The cannon was so powerful that it could only be fired 7 times a day because it needed to cool down, and it eventually exploded, but while it worked it did serious damage to those ancient walls. The Ottomans had dozens of other cannons too, smaller but still effective. This was relatively new technology at the time. Gunpowder weapons were starting to change warfare, and Constantinople was about to learn that lesson the hard way. The siege officially began on April 6, 1453. Mehmed's army surrounded the city on the land side, and his navy of over 100 ships blockaded it from the sea. Well, not quite completely from the sea. The Byzantines had this massive chain stretched across the Golden Horn, the inlet on the north side of the city, which kept the Ottoman ships out of that section. The Golden Horn was important because if the Ottomans could get ships in there, they could attack the sea walls, which were much weaker than the land walls. So the chain was crucial to the defense. The Ottomans started bombarding the walls immediately. Those cannons pounded away day after day. The Theodosian walls were incredibly thick, but they'd been built 1,000 years earlier for a different kind of warfare. They were designed to withstand battering rams and siege towers, not artillery. The stone balls from the cannons started to crack and crumble the walls. The defenders would work through the night to repair the damage, piling up rubble and wood and whatever else they could find to patch the gaps. But it was exhausting work, and they were running out of materials and manpower. The Ottomans tried several assaults on the walls during the first few weeks, but they were driven back each time. The defenders fought desperately. They had everything to lose. If the city fell, they knew what would happen. Ottoman law at the time said that if a city surrendered, it would be treated mercifully, but if it resisted and was taken by force, the attackers had the right to plunder it for 3 days. The defenders weren't going to surrender. Then Mehmed pulled off something really remarkable from an engineering standpoint, even if it was ultimately just a flex. Remember that chain across the Golden Horn? Mehmed couldn't break through it, so he decided to go around it. He had his men build a wooden road over the hills behind the Genoese colony of Galata, greased it up, and literally hauled about 70 ships overland and down into the Golden Horn. The Byzantines woke up one morning, and there was an Ottoman fleet inside their defensive perimeter. It was a logistical nightmare to pull off, but it worked. Now the defenders had to spread their already thin forces even thinner to protect the sea walls along the Golden Horn. The Byzantines tried to fight back. They attempted a night raid to burn the Ottoman ships in the Golden Horn, but it was betrayed or discovered, and the raid failed. They tried to negotiate. Mehmed offered Constantine a deal: surrender the city and you can leave in peace, or stay and rule as a vassal, or just leave and I'll give you territory elsewhere. Constantine refused. He'd been crowned emperor in Constantinople, and he would die there if necessary. There's this speech attributed to him where he supposedly said he would never surrender the city, that it was better to die fighting. It's probably at least partially made up by later historians, but it fits what we know about his character. By late May, the walls were in really bad shape. The constant bombardment had opened up several breaches. The defenders were exhausted from weeks of fighting and repair work. They were running low on gunpowder and supplies. Mehmed decided to make one final, massive assault. He set the date for May 29th. He gave his troops a pep talk, promised them the wealth of the city if they succeeded, and prepared for an all-out attack. The night before the final assault, Constantine gave his own speech to the defenders. He reminded them of their Roman heritage, of the glory of Constantinople, of their duty to defend Christendom. The whole city knew this was it. People gathered in the Hagia Sophia for one last service. Catholics and Orthodox prayed together, setting aside their theological disputes in the face of imminent destruction. Constantine attended and then went to make his rounds of the walls, checking on the defenders one last time. The Ottoman assault began in the early hours of May 29th, probably around 1:30 a.m. Mehmed sent in his troops in waves. First came the irregular troops, the Bashibazoks, basically cannon fodder meant to exhaust the defenders. They were driven back with heavy losses. Then came the Anatolian troops, better trained and equipped. They were also driven back, but they did more damage and wore down the defenders further. Finally, Mehmed sent in his elite troops, the Janissaries. These guys were the best soldiers in the Ottoman army, taken as children from Christian families, converted to Islam, and trained from childhood to be warriors. They were absolutely fanatical and highly skilled. The fighting was brutal, hand-to-hand combat on the walls, with the defenders desperately trying to hold back wave after wave of attackers. Then disaster struck. Giovanni Giustiniani, the Genoese commander who had been one of the most effective leaders of the defense, was wounded by a bullet or an arrow, depending on the source. He asked Constantine for permission to leave the walls to get medical treatment. Constantine reluctantly agreed. Giustiniani was taken to a ship, and he would actually die of his wounds a few days later. But his departure from the walls at this critical moment was devastating for morale. His men saw their commander leaving, and some of them panicked and abandoned their posts. Around the same time, the Ottomans discovered that a small gate in the walls, the Kirkaporta, had been left unlocked. It might have been left open by defenders who had made a sortie and forgot to lock it behind them, or it might have been deliberately left open by a traitor. We don't really know, but some Ottoman soldiers found it and pushed through. They climbed up onto the walls and started attacking the defenders from behind. The Ottomans were also making progress at the main breaches in the walls. The Janissaries pushed through at several points. Once they were inside the walls in significant numbers, the defense started to collapse. The defenders fell back in disorder. Constantine, seeing that the city was lost, reportedly tore off his imperial regalia so he wouldn't be recognized and threw himself into the fighting. He was never seen again. His body was never definitively identified, though the Ottomans claimed they found it later among piles of dead. He died fighting for his city, the last Roman emperor, ending a line that stretched back almost 1,500 years to Augustus. The Ottomans poured into the city. What followed was the 3 days of plunder that Ottoman law permitted. It was brutal. Thousands of civilians were killed. Thousands more were enslaved. Churches were looted. Houses were ransacked. The Great Library of Constantinople, one of the largest collections of ancient texts in the world, was destroyed. Priceless manuscripts were lost forever. The Hagia Sophia, the great cathedral that had stood for nearly 1,000 years, was converted into a mosque. Mehmed rode into the city and went straight to the Hagia Sophia. There's this story that he found a Turkish soldier trying to pry up the marble floor, and he struck the soldier, saying that the buildings were his now and shouldn't be damaged. He had the building cleaned and consecrated as a mosque, and it would remain one until the 20th century. The death toll from the siege and the sack is hard to pin down. Probably at least 4,000 defenders died in the fighting, maybe more. The number of civilians killed during the plunder is harder to estimate. Some sources say tens of thousands, others say fewer. A lot of people were enslaved rather than killed. The entire city was transformed. The Ottomans would make it their new capital, calling it Istanbul, though the name Constantinople persisted in Western sources for centuries. The fall of Constantinople sent shockwaves through Europe. This was the city that had stood for over 1,000 years. It was supposed to be eternal. Christian Europe was horrified and terrified. There were calls for a new crusade to retake the city, but nothing came of it. The Ottomans were too strong and Europe was too divided. The Pope tried to organize a coalition, but the European powers couldn't agree on anything. Meanwhile, Mehmed consolidated his conquest and continued expanding Ottoman power. He would go on to conquer more territory in the Balkans and Anatolia. He really earned that title, the Conqueror. The fall of Constantinople is often marked as the end of the Middle Ages and the beginning of the Renaissance, though that's a bit arbitrary. What it definitely did was cut off the old trade routes to the east that had gone through Constantinople. This was one of the factors that pushed European powers to look for new routes to Asia, which eventually led to the Age of Exploration and Columbus sailing west. Byzantine scholars fled to Italy, bringing ancient Greek texts with them, which contributed to the Renaissance interest in classical learning. So in a weird way, the fall of Constantinople helped spark some of the cultural developments that would define the early modern period. What's interesting to me about this whole event is how close it came to going the other way. If Giustiniani hadn't been wounded at that critical moment, if that gate hadn't been left open, if the defenders had held out just a little longer, maybe Mehmed would have given up. The Ottomans had been besieging the city for nearly 2 months. Mehmed's advisors were apparently urging him to abandon the siege. His troops were tired, he'd lost a lot of men, and there was no guarantee that one more assault would work. If the final assault on May 29th had failed, Mehmed might have packed up and left. Constantinople could have survived. Of course, it probably would have fallen eventually. The Byzantines were too weak and the Ottomans were too strong, but it might have lasted a few more years, maybe even decades. There's also the question of what would have happened if Western Europe had sent significant help. If the Pope had managed to organize a real relief force, if Venice and Genoa had sent their fleets, things could have been different, but the help never came. Constantine and his defenders were basically on their own. They fought incredibly bravely against overwhelming odds, but bravery wasn't enough. The other factor is those cannons. This was really one of the first major sieges where artillery played such a decisive role. The old medieval fortifications just couldn't stand up to gunpowder weapons. This would change military architecture going forward. Star forts and other designs would be developed to better withstand artillery. But Constantinople's walls were ancient, and while they'd been incredibly effective for 1,000 years, their time had passed. It's kind of symbolic, actually. The fall of Constantinople marks the end of an old order and the beginning of a new one, in more ways than one. Mehmed was 21 years old when he conquered Constantinople. 21. He'd been planning this for 2 years and he pulled it off. He would rule for another 28 years and continue expanding the Ottoman Empire, but Constantinople was his greatest achievement. It gave the Ottomans legitimacy as a world power. It gave them control of the straits between Europe and Asia. It gave them a magnificent capital. Mehmed saw himself as the heir to Rome, and in a way he was right. The Ottomans would call their realm the Sultanate of Rum, Rum being the Arabic word for Rome. They were the successors to the Roman Empire, just not in the way that Constantine XI would have wanted. For Constantine, it was a tragedy. He'd ruled for only 4 years and he spent most of that time watching his empire die. He knew the end was coming. He could have fled. He could have surrendered. He chose to stay and fight. There's something admirable about that, even if it was ultimately futile. He died defending his city, and in doing so, he became a legendary figure. Greeks would tell stories about him for centuries, that he hadn't really died but had been turned to marble and would return one day to reclaim the city. Of course, that never happened, but the legend shows how much his last stand meant to people. The fall of Constantinople was inevitable in some ways. The Byzantines had been declining for centuries. They'd lost too much territory, too much wealth, too much power. The Ottomans were rising and there wasn't much that could stop them. But the specific way it happened, the timing, the drama of that final siege, that was contingent on a lot of factors. Different decisions by Mehmed or Constantine, different timing on when the walls were breached, different luck with that gate being left open, and things could have gone differently. Not in the long run, probably, but in the short term. What strikes me most about this event is how it represents the end of something ancient. The Roman Empire, in one form or another, had existed for nearly 1,500 years. Constantinople had been its capital for over 1,100 of those years. And then in a matter of hours on May 29, 1453, it was over. The last emperor died fighting in the streets. The last remnant of Rome fell. An entire civilization that had shaped the Mediterranean world for over a millennium was gone. Of course, its influence lived on. Byzantine culture influenced the Ottomans. Byzantine scholars influenced the Renaissance. Byzantine Christianity shaped the Orthodox world, but the empire itself was finished. It's also a reminder of how warfare changes. Those walls had protected Constantinople for 1,000 years. They turned back countless enemies. But technology moved on, and suddenly walls that had seemed impregnable could be battered down by cannons. The defenders did everything right, fought bravely, used their limited resources well, but they were facing obsolescence. The medieval era of siege warfare was ending, and Constantinople was one of the last great sieges of that old style, even as it was also one of the first to show what artillery could do. The human cost was enormous. Thousands dead, thousands more enslaved, a great city sacked and transformed. Families destroyed, lives ruined, cultural treasures lost forever. That's the reality behind the grand historical narrative. For the people living through it, it wasn't about the end of an era or the rise of the Ottomans or any of that. It was about survival, about watching their world end, about losing everything. Mehmed's victory at Constantinople established the Ottoman Empire as the dominant power in the Eastern Mediterranean for the next few centuries. The Ottomans would continue expanding, threatening Vienna, controlling the Middle East, becoming one of the great empires of the early modern world. And it all really started with Constantinople. That conquest gave them the prestige, the strategic position, and the momentum they needed. So that's the fall of Constantinople, the end of the Byzantine Empire, the end of Rome, the end of an era. A desperate defense by a handful of brave men against overwhelming odds. A young sultan achieving what generations of his predecessors had failed to do. Ancient walls finally falling to modern weapons. A city that had stood for over a millennium finally conquered. It's one of those pivotal moments in history where you can really see the world changing, where an old order ends and a new one begins. And like the capture of Jerusalem in 1099, it came down to specific moments and decisions and bits of luck that could have gone either way. History turned, and nothing would be quite the same again.